"I'm the SEAL here," he boasted until she exposed the truth before. 1040 troops. Ryan Maddox grabbed Claire Bennett's mission map and threw it to the ground in front of 1040 soldiers. "You want to talk about tactics?" His voice cut across the entire field. "Then talk. Because I'm the SEAL here, not you." Claire did not move. She did not flinch. She looked at him with eyes that had seen things he could not imagine, and she said nothing. That silence made him angrier than any argument could. If this story speaks to you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way mornings always started at Camp Redstone training facility in the Arizona desert. Early, loud, and full of men who believed their rank told the entire story of who they were. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Maddox had been awake since 4 in the morning, which was not unusual for him. What was unusual was how good he felt. How alive. Because today was the kind of day Ryan Maddox had spent his entire career preparing for. A large-scale leadership evaluation. A real scenario. A chance to demonstrate in front of over 1,000 soldiers exactly what separated a Navy SEAL from everyone else on that field. He stood near the command tent, drinking coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier, and he did not care. He was watching the field fill up. Unit after unit soldiers from different branches, different backgrounds, different levels of experience, all assembling in formation for an exercise that the command had been planning for 6 weeks. Joint Operational Readiness Assessment. A simulated deployment scenario designed to test battlefield decision-making, tactical planning, and leadership under pressure. 1040 troops. That was the number that had been circulating through the base for days. 1040 soldiers would participate in or witness this evaluation. Ryan Maddox looked at that crowd and felt something he had felt many times before. He felt like the most qualified person on the field. Not arrogant, he would have told you. Just accurate. He had completed 11 combat deployments. He had operated in conditions that most soldiers could not survive, let alone succeed in. He had bled for this country in places whose names he was not allowed to speak out loud. He had earned every decoration on his uniform through actions, not ceremonies. To Ryan Maddox, that history was not something he was proud of privately. It was something he carried like a weapon, something he displayed, something he used. He believed in the way that some men believe in religion or gravity, that experience was the only currency that mattered in a military context. And he had more of it than almost anyone standing on that field. Almost anyone. He noticed Lieutenant Claire Bennett for the first time when she walked toward the tactical briefing area, carrying a thick mission folder under her arm. She was 28 years old, which he clocked immediately. Young. She wore her uniform the way someone wears clothes, not armor. There was nothing performative about how she moved. No deliberate authority in her stride. She simply walked from point A to point B, opened her folder, and began reviewing maps with the kind of quiet focus that some people carry, and most people cannot manufacture. Ryan watched her for about 30 seconds. Military intelligence specialist. He had been told that much in the pre-briefing notes. An analyst. Someone who studied enemy movements and terrain data and translated information into mission plans that other people then executed. He had worked alongside plenty of analysts over the years. Good people, most of them. Smart people, some of them. But not the same as operators. Not the same as the men and women who took those plans and walked into the dark with them. He looked away. She was not particularly relevant to his morning. The briefing began at 0700 hours. General Marcus Holloway stood at the front of the command space, broad-shouldered, measured, the kind of officer whose silence commanded more attention than most men's speeches. He outlined the scenario. The 1040 troops would be divided into competing operational groups. Each group would be evaluated on how they planned and executed a simulated attack and extraction against a prepared enemy force. Observers from the command staff would score each decision in real time. The evaluation was not about winning the scenario on paper. It was about the quality of leadership decisions under conditions designed to be deliberately stressful. Ryan Maddox was assigned as the primary tactical advisor for the blue team. He accepted that assignment the way he accepted most things, as confirmation of something he already knew about himself. Claire Bennett was introduced as the intelligence support officer for the same team. Ryan barely registered it. The planning phase began immediately. Maps were spread across tables. Topographical data was reviewed. Enemy disposition reports were analyzed. Ryan moved through the planning process with the aggression and confidence of a man who had done this hundreds of times in situations where getting it wrong meant people died. He was decisive. He was direct. He had no patience for hesitation or excess caution, and he said so multiple times in ways that his team absorbed as leadership, and that a more careful observer might have classified as something else. About 20 minutes into the planning phase, Claire Bennett spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was not urgent. It carried the specific kind of calm that belongs to people who are very certain of what they are saying, and have no need to perform that certainty for anyone else. Chief, the Eastern approach is a trap. The planning area went quiet. Not the dramatic silence of a room holding its breath. The practical silence of people who had been in the middle of something and suddenly stopped because a statement had been made that required attention. Ryan turned to look at her. He took his time with it. Deliberate. The kind of move a man makes when he wants the room to understand that he is not surprised or concerned, just mildly curious about what could possibly have prompted such a comment. A trap, he said. It was not a question. It was a restatement. The way you repeat something a child has said that does not quite make sense. Yes. Claire pointed to the eastern corridor on the map without theatrics. The terrain funnels any advancing force into a single viable pathway, approximately 400 meters before the objective. If the opposing force has studied standard doctrine, and their setup suggests they have, they will have positioned at least one defensive element here and a secondary blocking position here. The valley gives the appearance of the fastest route. That is why it is the most dangerous one. Ryan listened. He let her finish. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has already decided what something is and is now watching it confirm his expectations. You know what the problem is with analysts. He did not lower his voice. He did not pull her aside. He spoke the way a man speaks when he wants a room to hear him, and the room heard him. They spend so much time looking at maps that they forget what combat actually feels like. A few soldiers on the team shifted their weight. Small movements. The kind that happen when people are uncomfortable, but not willing to say so. Claire did not shift. She looked at him with the same even expression she had been wearing since the briefing started. Chief, I understand the observation, but the terrain data is clear, and the enemy pattern of life over the past 3 simulated cycles supports a defensive setup specifically designed to exploit exactly the approach you are currently favoring. Pattern of life. Ryan said it slowly, like he was tasting something he did not order. You're talking about patterns on paper. I'm talking about patterns that predict behavior. And I'm talking about a valley I would take in 12 minutes with the right element. He pointed to the map, his finger landing on the eastern corridor, with the confidence of a man who has been right about things like this before and expects to be right again. Clean approach. Minimal exposure until the last 200 meters. Direct line to the objective. Which is what they want you to think. The words came out of her mouth without heat, without edge, without anything except the simple and precise delivery of a conclusion she had reached and was not going to pretend she had not reached. Something changed in Ryan Maddox's expression. It was not rage. It was something quieter and more dangerous. It was the expression of a man who has been contradicted in front of people he expects to defer to him and who is now deciding what to do about it. He turned to face her fully. I'm the SEAL here. His voice carried across the entire planning area, past the immediate circle of officers, out toward the troops assembling nearby, into the air of that field in a way that made the statement feel like a declaration rather than a correction. I'm the one who has been in real fights, not behind a screen. Claire held his gaze. She did not apologize. She did not backpedal. She did not reach for softening language or diplomatic hedging. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at a piece of information they have already processed and filed. Ryan took a step toward her. Not aggressive. Calculated. The kind of step that says, I am going to make sure you understand where the line is. Maybe what we need here, he said louder now, turning slightly so the words could reach the soldiers who were definitely listening, is for everyone to see the difference between someone who studies war. He looked at Claire. And someone who survives it. Nobody spoke. Not the officers around the planning table. Not the soldiers within earshot. Not General Holloway, who was standing at a measured distance and watching everything with the focused stillness of a man who is collecting information rather than reacting to it. Claire's response was 3 words. That won't be necessary. Ryan Maddox did not hear it as wisdom. He heard it as retreat. He heard it the way people hear things when they have already decided what they are listening for, and the sound he was listening for was confirmation that he was right, and she was backing down. He was wrong on both counts, but he did not know that yet. He turned back to the planning table and continued with his preferred approach. The Eastern Corridor, the direct line, the path that looked clean and felt right to a man who had made his career on decisive forward movement. The planning phase ended. The exercise began, and Ryan Maddox led his team into the valley with the certainty of a man who has never seriously considered that the thing he was most confident about might also be the thing most likely to destroy him. The Eastern Corridor was exactly what Claire had said it was. The opposing force had established a defensive position at the natural choke point, 400 meters from the objective. The blue team's advance compressed into the predicted pathway. Communication broke down in the way it breaks down when a force moves into terrain that works against them. The simulation scoring registered 3 critical failures in the first 7 minutes. Command elements isolated. Objective unachieved. Extraction compromised. When Ryan Maddox walked out of the valley scenario, his team behind him, the simulation evaluators already marking their assessments. He did not look at Claire Bennett. He walked straight to the center of the field, where 1040 soldiers were now assembled, in a configuration that felt less like a training exercise and more like a court. General Holloway's voice came from somewhere near the command platform. "Chief Maddox." Ryan turned. "The evaluation team has completed its first phase scoring." The general did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Blue team primary objective failure. Contributing factor approach, corridor selection. Inconsistent with intelligence assessment provided at planning stage. The field absorbed that. 1040 soldiers processing the information in real time. Some of them had not been close enough to hear the exchange during the planning phase. Now they were hearing the outcome, and they were doing the math. Ryan Maddox did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "The intelligence assessment was based on pattern analysis, sir, not ground truth experience." General Holloway looked at him for a long moment. "The intelligence assessment was correct, Chief." Silence. The specific kind of silence that follows a statement so flat and precise that there is no available response that does not make things worse. Ryan Maddox stood in that silence and felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like he was losing, not the exercise, something larger. He looked across the field toward where Claire Bennett was standing near a group of evaluation officers, reviewing the scenario data with the same unperturbed focus she had brought to every other moment that morning. She was not looking at him. She was not performing satisfaction or vindication. She was working. And somehow that was worse. He made a decision. It was not a careful decision. It was the kind of decision a man makes when he has too much pride and too little information, and when he genuinely believes that the problem is not his judgment, but the audience's failure to understand it. He walked toward the center of the field. He called out to the troops, "We're going to do a demonstration." The word moved through 1040 soldiers the way a current moves through water. Immediate, conductive. General Holloway did not stop him. He stood with his arms behind his back and watched with the expression of a man who has decided to let events proceed to their natural conclusion. Ryan Maddox turned to face the crowd of soldiers and spoke with the full weight of his conviction. Tactical decision-making is not an academic exercise. His voice was powerful, practiced the kind of voice that has commanded men in darkness and chaos and brought them home. It is a physical reality, It lives in the body. It lives in the blood. You develop it through years of real exposure to real danger, not through reading reports. He paused. I want to demonstrate the difference between theoretical knowledge and operational experience. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him. And in that exchange, something passed between them that most of the soldiers watching would not have been able to name. On his side, it was challenge performance and the specific arrogance of a man who has never lost in front of an audience this size. On her side, it was something harder to categorize. Recognition, perhaps. The quiet acknowledgement that the moment had arrived and she had always known it was going to. Maddox called out to his team. Senior Chief Hayes. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes stepped forward. Lucas was a man whose reputation preceded him the way weather precedes a storm. Former combat instructor. Certified in 12 different hand-to-hand disciplines. A man who had spent 3 years teaching new SEAL candidates how to hurt people efficiently and survive being hurt efficiently in return. He was not significantly taller than Claire Bennett, but he moved with the specific economy of motion that belongs to people who have been trained to minimize effort and maximize effectiveness. He looked at Claire. He looked at Maddox. He looked at the 1040 soldiers watching, and to his credit, which would become relevant later. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes looked uncomfortable, not afraid, not reluctant in a way that suggested weakness. Uncomfortable in the way that happens when a person with good instincts senses that they have been put in a situation that is not what it appears to be. He approached Claire carefully. Lieutenant, he said, and his voice was lower than expected, private-scaled, despite the audience. I don't want this to become a show. Neither do I, Claire said. The words were identical to what she had said to Maddox 15 minutes earlier. That won't be necessary. But the tone was different. Because she was not saying it to retreat. She was saying it because she meant it. Because she genuinely at that moment would have preferred that none of this was happening in front of 1040 people on a training field in the Arizona desert. But it was happening, and Claire Bennett had long since learned that what you prefer and what is required of you are frequently not the same thing. The exercise began. Lucas moved first, not reckless, controlled. The kind of attack that a trained evaluator would score as technically sound appropriate distance management, center of gravity engagement, designed to test the opponent's response rather than simply overwhelm them. He was not trying to humiliate her. He was doing his job, respecting the scenario, respecting in the way that becomes visible only in retrospect the woman he was facing. Claire watched him come, and the watching was visible. That was the thing that made the soldiers nearest to the demonstration area go quiet first, before anyone further back understood what they were seeing. She was not bracing. She was not calculating in the obvious way the way people calculate when they are afraid and trying not to show it. She was observing. His movement. His weight distribution. The way his left shoulder dropped a half degree before his right side committed. The rhythm of his breathing. The specific geometry of how he was choosing to close the distance. She saw all of it. She processed all of it. And then she moved. One step. Lateral. Small. The kind of movement that looks from a distance like it should not be sufficient to change anything. It changed everything. Lucas Hayes's momentum, precise and controlled and expertly directed, encountered a direction that was no longer there. His weight committed to a forward vector that Claire had vacated. The redirection was not forceful. It did not need to be. Physics does not require assistance when it is already working in your favor. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes went to the ground. He did not fall dramatically. He went down the way skilled people go down when they have been outmaneuvered by someone whose skill exceeds their own, which is to say with a kind of mechanical inevitability that looks to trained eyes more shocking than any dramatic tumble would. The field went silent. Not the silence of 1040 people trying to be quiet. The silence of 1040 people who have just watched something that recalibrated what they thought they were watching. Lucas Hayes looked up from the ground. His expression was not what Ryan Maddox had expected to see there. It was not embarrassment. It was not the red-faced outrage of a man whose ego has been publicly punctured. It was something close to wonder. He stared at Claire Bennett from the ground, the way a person stares at something they have heard described but never actually seen. Processing. Recalibrating. Reaching for a framework that would make sense of what had just happened to him. Claire reached down and offered him her hand. Lucas took it. He stood. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said in a voice quiet enough that only the people closest could hear it clearly. "Lieutenant, where did you learn that?" Claire held his gaze. "Somewhere I no longer talk about." The murmur that moved through the crowd at that moment was not the murmur of confusion. It was the murmur of recognition. The sound 1040 people make when they collectively understand that the story they thought they were watching is not the story that is actually being told. Ryan Maddox stood at the edge of the demonstration area. His arms were still crossed. His expression had not moved. But something behind his eyes had shifted. Because Ryan Maddox was not a stupid man. He was a proud man. He was a man whose pride had calcified over years into something that looked like conviction and felt from the inside like certainty. But he was not stupid, and he had seen exactly what Lucas Hayes had seen. The woman he had called a screen watcher in front of 1,000 soldiers had just put his most experienced operator on the ground in under 3 seconds, using a technique he had never seen applied at that speed, with that precision, outside of classified advanced training environments. His jaw tightened. He did not look at General Holloway. He looked at Claire Bennett, who was standing calmly near the evaluation markers, not performing anything, not waiting for applause, already returning her attention to the mission data folder she had been carrying since the briefing. And Ryan Maddox made the second bad decision of his morning. He stepped forward. "Enough," he said. His voice was controlled. It was the control of a man holding something back, rather than the control of a man who has nothing to hold. "If we're talking about real combat, then let's see what real combat looks like." Claire looked at him. "Chief." Her voice was steady. "This isn't necessary. You told me the Eastern approach was a trap." His voice was low now, enough that it did not carry to all 1040 soldiers, but it carried to the ones nearest to them, and from those soldiers it would travel. "You were right. I want to know who I'm actually dealing with. You don't need a demonstration for that." "Maybe I do." General Holloway said nothing. He stood at the edge of the field with his hands clasped behind his back, and he watched with the focused neutrality of a man who has already made peace with what is about to happen. The soldiers nearest to the demonstration area had gone completely still. Claire looked at Ryan Maddox for a long moment. She looked at him the way she had looked at the mission map during the briefing. The way she looked at everything with the systematic attention of someone who is gathering information rather than experiencing emotion. And then very quietly she nodded. "All right, Chief." She set down her folder. "Then let's make it clear." Ryan Maddox stepped into the circle. The 1040 soldiers, who had been assembled on that field for a joint operational readiness assessment, had now become something else entirely. They were witnesses. And not one of them in that moment knew that the woman standing across from Ryan Maddox had once operated under a call sign that elite units in 3 different theaters had spoken about the way soldiers speak about things they cannot fully explain. Not one of them knew what Claire Bennett had survived. Not one of them knew what she had been before she became a lieutenant with a mission folder in the Arizona desert. Not yet. Ryan Maddox stepped into the circle the way he stepped into everything. Like he had already decided how it ended. Claire Bennett stood across from him, without posturing, without adjustment, without any of the physical preparation that most trained soldiers display when they know a confrontation is about to begin. She simply stood. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. Her breathing was unchanged. Her eyes were on him with the same quality of attention she had been giving to mission maps and tactical data all morning, which was the quality of someone who is not watching a performance, but reading a text. Ryan noticed that. He did not know what to do with it, but he noticed it. He moved first. Not because he was reckless. Because he was experienced enough to know that waiting gives the other person time to think. And he had already decided that thinking was not this woman's advantage over him. Physical reality was his domain. Operational instinct. The kind of knowledge that lives below the level of thought in the muscle and the bone and the years of training stacked so deep they become reflex. He came at her with controlled aggression, the kind that has been honed and tempered by years of real application. Not the wild force of a man trying to prove something, but the focused economical power of someone who has learned exactly how much effort is required to end a confrontation and has learned not to waste a single unit of it. Claire moved, not away, not backward, sideways and into him in the same motion, a single fluid redirection that took the kinetic energy he was bringing and rotated it the way a door swings on a hinge, using the weight of what was coming rather than trying to stop it. Ryan felt his own momentum become a problem. His left knee hit the ground first. I was up in under 2 seconds, which was fast, genuinely fast. The kind of recovery that only happens when a body has been trained to override the instinct to stay down. He turned back to face her, and what he saw on her face was nothing. Not satisfaction, not focus, not even the carefully maintained blankness of someone who is suppressing an emotion. Just the same clear, even attention, like she was still reading. Again, he said. It was not a request. Claire did not agree or disagree. She simply waited. He came at her differently this time, adjusting his angle, his lead, his commitment point, all the micro-corrections that a trained operator makes between attempts. The internal debriefing that happens in real time when something has not gone as expected. He was adapting. That was real. That was not performance. But she had already seen the adaptation before it resolved into movement. The second exchange lasted 4 seconds longer than the first. The outcome was the same. Ryan Maddox went down again this time, harder this time with the specific quality of impact that comes when a body's own force is turned fully against it, and he stayed on the ground for a beat longer than the first time. Not because he was hurt, because something was happening in his mind that was taking up processing space that he normally would have been using to get back to his feet. I was trying to understand what she was doing, and he could not. Not technically, not mechanically. The movements were too fast, and the principles underlying them were not anything in his known vocabulary of disciplines. He had trained in enough systems to recognize most things. He was not recognizing this. And that was in the specific emotional language of Ryan Maddox terrifying. He got up. The field was so quiet that the sound of his boots on the ground carried. 1040. Soldiers, and the loudest thing was the sound of a man standing up for the second time after being put down by a woman he had publicly dismissed 3 hours earlier. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes was standing near the edge of the demonstration area. His arms were at his sides. His face was not the face of a man watching a competition. It was the face of a man watching a revelation. Because Lucas Hayes had trained for years in systems that the general military population never encountered. He had been taught by instructors whose names were not in any public record. He had spent time in facilities that did not appear on base maps. And he was watching Claire Bennett move in ways that he recognized not from personal experience, but from description. From the specific careful descriptions that his own classified instructors had given him of a training approach, so demanding and so unusual that most of the people put through it did not complete it. He had heard stories. He had not believed all of them. He believed them now. Ryan Maddox looked at Claire across the distance of the circle. His chest was moving faster than he would have wanted it to in front of this many people. His left shoulder had taken impact and would remind him of that for the next 3 days. His pride was in a condition he had no vocabulary for, because pride in Ryan Maddox had never truly been tested at this level before, and the absence of a framework for managing what he was feeling was making everything worse. "What are you?" he said. The question came out raw, without the shell of performance around it. For one moment, it was just a man asking a genuine question because he did not have an answer. Claire looked at him. "A lieutenant," she said. "Intelligence specialist. That's what my file says." "That's not what I just watched." "What you just watched is what happens when you spend enough time studying something from every angle." Her voice was even, but not cold. There was something in it that was almost careful. The care a person takes when they are aware that words are going to land somewhere that is already bruised. "You said analysts look at maps and forget what combat feels like. That's not always true, Chief." Maddox stared at her. Around them the field had begun to breathe again. The collective stillness of 1040 soldiers was loosening into something more active. The movement of people who have seen something significant and are beginning to process it through conversation. Murmurs. Low voices. The specific sound of a crowd rearranging its understanding of what it had just witnessed. General Holloway moved from his position near the command platform. Not quickly. He walked with the unhurried authority of a man who does not need to rush because the situation will wait for him, which was true. The situation absolutely waited for him. He stopped a few feet from where Ryan Maddox was standing. He did not look at Maddox. He looked at Claire. "Lieutenant Bennett," he said. "Sir." "Are you injured?" "No, sir." Holloway nodded once. Then he turned to look at the troops assembled across the field, and something in his expression shifted very slightly in the direction of a man who is about to do something he has been waiting to do for a specific reason and a specific time, and has decided that both have arrived. "Everybody take a break," he said. 15 minutes. It was not 15 minutes. It was 22, and in those 22 minutes, the field at Camp Redstone became something that military installations rarely become, which is a place where people talk honestly about what they just saw. Not through official channels, not in the careful, rank-aware language of formal debrief. In the direct, unfiltered language of human beings who have just watched something that did not match their expectations and are trying to recalibrate. Staff Sergeant Dion Reeves had been standing in the second row of the assembled troops when the demonstration happened. He was a 10-year veteran. He had served in 2 combat deployments. He was not easily impressed, which was something he had always privately taken pride in. He turned to the soldier standing next to him. Corporal Marisol Vega, who was 23 years old and on her first major training exercise, and he said, "Did you see her feet?" Marisol had seen her feet. "She never planted," Dion said. "Not once. Most people, when they're about to engage, they plant. She never stopped moving. You know what kind of training teaches you to never stop moving?" Marisol did not know. "The kind that most people never get access to," Dion said. 3 rows back. Captain Jerome Whitfield was having a different conversation with his executive officer. Jerome was a man who read people the way some people read weather as a professional necessity, developed over years of having to make decisions about who to trust in environments where getting that wrong had consequences. He had been watching Claire Bennett since before the exercise began. Not because she had done anything to attract attention, because she had done the opposite. Because in a field full of people performing their competence for an evaluation, she had been the only one who did not appear to be performing anything at all. She knew, Jerome said to his XO. She knew when she walked in this morning exactly how this was going to go. She has known every step of this. His XO frowned. "You think she planned the demonstration?" "I think she knew Maddox well enough to know he was going to create one." Jerome watched her across the field, still standing near the evaluation markers reviewing data. "And I think she knew what was going to happen when he did." Back near the demonstration area, Senior Chief Lucas Hayes had found a reason to position himself near the tactical briefing table where Claire was working. It was not particularly subtle, which he would have been the first to admit, but subtlety had not been his primary training priority. He stood near her for a moment without saying anything. Claire did not look up from the data. "You can ask the question," she said. Lucas exhaled. "I've seen techniques like that described exactly twice. Once in a training environment that had a 3-level clearance requirement just to enter the building. Once in a debrief from an operation I was not part of, conducted in a theater I was not cleared to operate in." He paused. "Neither of those times was I watching a lieutenant who officially specializes in pattern analysis." Claire was quiet for a moment. "The official specialization," she said, "is accurate. It's not complete." She looked up at him then, and what Lucas Hayes saw in her eyes was not evasion. It was something more complicated than evasion. It was the expression of a person who is making a calculation in real time about what to say, not because they are hiding something shameful, but because some truths carry weight that cannot be fully transferred in a single conversation in a field in Arizona. "No," she said finally. "It's not complete." Lucas nodded slowly. He looked back toward where Maddox was standing alone, now slightly separate from the group of officers near the command platform. Maddox was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the ground in the specific way that people look at the ground when they are conducting an internal conversation they would not want observed. "He's not a bad man," Lucas said quietly. "No," Claire agreed. "He's not. He's just spent a long time being the most capable person in any given room." Lucas paused. "That does something to people. Makes them stop looking." Claire said nothing. "He stopped looking," Lucas said. "He looked at you and he stopped." There was a pause. "Most people do," Claire said. It was not self-pity. It was not bitterness. It was the flat, factual delivery of a truth that had been tested and confirmed so many times that it had lost the power to surprise her. The 15 minutes ended, and General Holloway called the troops back to formation. But the field that reassembled was not the same field that had dispersed. The charge in it was different. The attention it brought to the front was sharper, more personal. The kind of attention that emerges not from obligation, but from genuine investment in what happens next. Holloway stood before the 1040 soldiers and let the silence build for exactly long enough. "This morning's first phase produced data," he said. "Some of it was expected, some of it was not." He clasped his hands behind his back. What was expected was that the evaluation would test decision-making under pressure. What was not expected, or rather what was not officially scheduled, was the additional demonstration that some of you observed. Nobody moved. "I want to address something directly," Holloway continued. "Because I believe that what happened this morning, all of what happened, carries a lesson that is more valuable than anything we scripted into this assessment." Ryan Maddox was standing at the edge of the assembled officers. His posture was correct. His bearing was correct. Everything that could be maintained through discipline alone was being maintained. But the thing behind it, the absolute unquestioned certainty that had been as much a part of him as his rank, was not entirely there anymore. And the absence of it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. "In this military," Holloway said, "we spend a great deal of time and energy establishing hierarchies of credibility. We use rank. We use deployment history. We use physical performance. We use the categories we have built to signal to each other and to ourselves where value lives and where it does not." He paused. "Some of those signals are accurate. Many of them are incomplete." The field absorbed this. What I watched this morning was a qualified, experienced officer dismiss a colleague's tactical assessment based on a category he had assigned to her before she had finished speaking. Holloway let that land. The assessment was correct. The dismissal had consequences. Those are facts, not opinions. Ryan Maddox's jaw was tight. Holloway did not look at him when he said it, which somehow made it worse. "What I also watched this morning was 1040 soldiers recalibrate their understanding of what they were looking at based on new information." He let a small pause fall. "That is the correct response to new information. I want to commend that. I also want to point out that the new information was always there. The only thing that changed was whether we were willing to look for it." A sergeant in the third row shifted his weight and then went still again. "We're going to run the second phase of this evaluation differently than planned," Holloway said. "Lieutenant Bennett will serve as primary tactical advisor for the integrated team. I want every officer on this field paying attention not just to outcomes, but to process. How decisions are made, what information is weighted, what is dismissed, and why." He looked at the assembled troops with the measured authority of a man who understands that the most important things he will say in his career are usually the things he says in moments like this one. "I do not want you to take away from this morning a story about who won a demonstration. I want you to take away a question. Ask yourself what you stopped looking at today because you had already decided it was not worth looking at. Ask yourself that question every morning when you put on this uniform." He let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Dismissed to Phase 2. The field broke into motion. And in the motion of 1040 soldiers moving toward the next phase of an evaluation that none of them would remember. The same way they had remembered evaluations before, two things were happening simultaneously that would shape the rest of the day at Camp Redstone. The first was that Claire Bennett picked up her mission folder, walked to the tactical planning table, and began laying out the Phase 2 approach with the same quiet efficiency she had been bringing to every task since 0700 hours. Officers gathered around her, not because Holloway had told them to, or not only because of that, but because something had shifted in the field, in the collective understanding of the people on it. And the shift had a gravity that was pulling people toward the source. The second was that Ryan Maddox, Chief Petty Officer, decorated Navy SEAL man of 11 deployments and more confirmed operational decisions than he could accurately count, walked to the edge of the field and stood there alone for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. He was not looking at the planning table. He was not looking at the assembled troops. He was looking at nothing in particular. He was thinking. I was thinking about what he had said that morning. The specific words. "I'm the SEAL here." He was running them back through his mind with the unflinching honesty that he almost always applied to post-mission debrief and had not this morning applied to himself before speaking. I was thinking about the Eastern Corridor, about Claire's voice when she said the approach was a trap, about the way she had pointed to the map without drama, without urgency, without any of the performance that he had unconsciously required from someone he was going to take seriously, and how her absence of performance had read to him as absence of substance. He was thinking about Lucas Hayes on the ground. He was thinking about himself on the ground. I was thinking about 1040 people watching. And then he was thinking about something he had not let himself think about yet, which was the question Lucas had asked Claire and the answer she had given. Where did you learn that "somewhere I no longer talk about"? Ryan Maddox had been in enough classified environments and enough restricted conversations to know exactly what that answer meant. It was not evasion. It was precision. The specific, careful precision of a person describing a reality that exists in a space where language and open acknowledgement are not available options. Which meant that Claire Bennett had a history. A real one. The kind that did not appear in standard personnel files. The kind that explained things. He turned back toward the field. Captain Jerome Whitfield was passing nearby, and Ryan stopped him. "Captain." Jerome turned. His expression was carefully neutral, which was itself a kind of answer. "How much do you know about Lieutenant Bennett?" Ryan asked. Jerome looked at him for a moment. "Probably less than I should," he said. "Probably more than she intended." "What do you know?" Jerome glanced toward the planning table where Claire was speaking to a group of officers who were leaning in with the focused attention of people receiving information they trust. "I know she's been attached to this command for 8 months, Jerome said. "I know her official record is clean, thorough, and exactly detailed enough to tell you nothing you couldn't verify through standard channels. I know that 3 months ago, when we had the border reconnaissance failure on the north edge of the training grid, she had the corrected analysis on Holloway's desk in 40 minutes. He paused. "I also know that the analysis was not just correct. It was structured in a way that I've only ever seen from people who've been inside the environment they're analyzing. Not reading about it. Inside it." Ryan processed that. "And you didn't ask?" "I asked," Jerome said. "Once." He looked at Ryan steadily. "She thanked me for my curiosity and changed the subject so smoothly, I was 3 minutes into a different conversation before I realized what had happened." Ryan was quiet. "Whatever she is," Jerome said, "whatever she was before she was Lieutenant Bennett, with an intelligence specialist designation chief, it is not what her file says it is." He held Ryan's gaze. "And I think you know that now." Ryan did not answer immediately. Because Jerome Whitfield was right, and the process of accepting that rightness was happening in real time, slowly and without grace. The way important things often happen in men who have spent long careers being certain. "Yeah," Ryan Maddox said finally. "Just that. One word. Carrying the specific weight of a man who has said something true at a cost he has not finished calculating." He walked back toward the field. He did not go to the planning table. Not yet. I went to the evaluation area and asked one of the scoring officers for the Phase 1 results breakdown. Full breakdown. Individual decision points, scoring rationale, the complete analytical record of what had happened during the Eastern Corridor approach. He read it. Every line. He read the point at which the evaluation team had flagged the corridor selection as a critical decision junction. He read the notation that an alternative approach had been identified in the pre-scenario intelligence brief. He read the scoring of his decision against the available data with the specific, merciless attention that a man gives to something he is finally willing to see clearly. It was worse than he had thought, not because he had been dramatically wrong, because he had been systematically wrong, because the error was not a single decision made in bad information, but a pattern of filtering out information that did not match the framework he had already built. The evaluation team had captured every moment, every point at which Claire's data had been available to him, every point at which he had not used it. He set the breakdown down. He looked across the field to where General Holloway was speaking quietly with a pair of senior evaluation officers. Holloway caught his eye for exactly 1 second. Not accusation, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who has watched a lesson land and is noting the moment it arrived. Ryan looked away first. He stood there in this field at Camp Redstone, decorated SEAL 11 deployments, the kind of man whose file made younger soldiers speak in a certain reverent register, and he felt something he had not felt since the early days of his training. He felt genuinely uncertain, not about tactics, not about capability, about himself, about the way he had built the structure of his certainty and what it had cost him to maintain it and what it had cost other people when he used it wrong. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was, he would think later, the most important one he had experienced in years. And it had been delivered to him by a woman he had refused to look at, somewhere on the field. Claire Bennett was still working, still planning, still giving to the 1040 soldiers around her the same quality of focused, undemonstrative competence she had been giving since the beginning of the morning, completely indifferent to whether any of it was being noticed, because she had operated for long enough in spaces where being noticed was a liability rather than a reward. She did not know exactly what Ryan Maddox was thinking in that moment, but she had a very good idea, because she had seen that expression before, on other faces, in other fields. In the specific, unmistakable moment when a person's certainty breaks apart and something more honest begins to take its place. She had learned across the years and the missions and the silences that she no longer talked about that this was not a comfortable thing to witness in another person. But it was the only real beginning of anything worth building. Phase 2 of the Joint Operational Readiness Assessment began at 10:47 in the morning, and from the first minute it was nothing like Phase 1. The difference was not in the scenario. The scenario was equally demanding, equally layered, equally designed to create the kind of pressure that separates the decisions people think they would make from the decisions they actually make, when consequences are real and time is short. The difference was in the room, in the field, in the specific quality of attention that 1040 soldiers brought to the second phase after what they had seen in the first. They were watching differently now. Not Maddox, not the SEAL credentials and the deployment record and the decorated chest. They were watching Claire Bennett move through a tactical planning process, and what they were watching was not a performance. That was the thing that kept catching people off guard, kept making officers who had been in the military for 15 and 20 years lean slightly forward without meaning to. There was no performance in it. She did not explain herself as she worked. She did not check whether people were following. She did not look for approval at the end of each decision. She simply worked, and the work was so clean, so precise, so structurally complete, that following it felt less like watching a superior officer plan, and more like watching a master craftsman who has long since stopped thinking about the individual movements of their own hands. Captain Jerome Whitfield watched from 6 feet away and said nothing for 11 straight minutes. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "She already ran this scenario." The lieutenant standing next to him turned. "Sir, before today, before this morning, she already ran it." Jerome kept his eyes on Claire. "Look at the decision sequence. She's not building the plan in real time. She's executing a plan she already completed. She's translating it for us." The lieutenant looked at the planning table and then back at Jerome. "That's not possible. The scenario parameters were classified until 0600 this morning." Jerome said nothing. because Jerome Whitfield had long since learned that there are two categories of impossible things: things that cannot be done, and things that cannot be done by the people you have been imagining when you said cannot. Ryan Maddox stood at the edge of the planning group. I was not leading it. He had not stepped back dramatically or made a show of deferring. He had simply, in the way that real changes happen, moved. He was standing where a man stands when he is genuinely listening instead of waiting for his turn to be right. He watched Claire's hands on the map. He watched the way she absorbed questions from the officers around her, the way she processed objections, not as challenges to manage, but as data points to integrate, the way she built consensus, without asking for it, simply by being so clearly correct that agreement became the path of least resistance. It was making him feel things he did not have comfortable words for. Not admiration alone. Something older and less comfortable than admiration. The specific grief of a man recognizing too late and too clearly what he had refused to see when it was first in front of him. Sergeant Dion Reeves was standing 20 feet from the planning table with his arms crossed, watching. Corporal Marisol Vega was next to him, and she had given up pretending she was not completely riveted. She corrected the northern approach twice in the last 5 minutes, Marisol said, both times before the officers suggested it. She's not correcting it after, Dion said. She's correcting it before. She sees it coming. How do you see something like that coming? Dion was quiet for a moment. You see it when you've been on the wrong end of it enough times. When you've been the person on the map, not just the person reading the map. He paused. She's been on the map. Marisol looked at him. What does that mean? It means, Dion said carefully, that somebody somewhere put her in the exact situations she's describing, and that she came back. The Phase 2 scenario completed at 12:19. Blue Team primary objective achieved. Secondary objectives achieved. Extraction completed within scenario parameters. Evaluation scoring highest composite score recorded in the Joint Assessment's 6-year history at Camp Redstone. When the scoring officer read that last line, a sound went through the assembled troops that was not quite applause and not quite silence. It was the sound of a collective exhale from 1040 people who had been holding something and were only now releasing it. General Holloway said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That will be noted." Ryan Maddox heard the score and felt two things at the same time. Pride, because he had been part of the team that achieved it, and something that sat directly alongside the pride without merging with it. A recognition that the score existed because of decisions he had not made, because of a framework he had not built, because of a woman whose name he had not bothered to know before this morning. He walked to the edge of the field. I took out the Phase 1 results breakdown he had been carrying, and he read it again. He did not need to. He had already memorized it. He read it because he had learned in 11 deployments, in places whose names he could not say, that the most important habit a person can build is the habit of returning to the thing that showed them where they were wrong and looking at it again. Looking at it until it stops being painful and becomes simply true. He put it away. He looked across the field. The field gathered. All 1040 soldiers, evaluation officers, tactical staff, everyone assembled with the practiced speed of a military force that has spent the day in a state of elevated focus and is now directing that focus toward a single point. Holloway stood on the platform and looked at the assembled troops for a long moment. "Before I close today's assessment," he said, "I want to address something that has been circulating through this field all morning. A question. Not an official question. Not a question on any evaluation form." He paused. "Who is Lieutenant Bennett?" The field went absolutely still. Claire, standing near the tactical table, did not move. Her expression did not change. But something in her posture shifted, a very small thing. The kind of shift that only happens in people who have trained themselves not to react to unexpected developments, but whose body registers those developments anyway. One layer below the surface of control. Holloway opened the folder. "What I'm about to share has been authorized for release by the relevant oversight authority as of 0500 this morning," he said. "What I'm about to share is not complete. There are elements of Lieutenant Bennett's service record that will remain classified indefinitely for reasons that I am not able to specify, for reasons that those of you with appropriate clearance level will be able to infer, and for reasons that I want the rest of you to simply accept as being of the category of things that your country does on your behalf in spaces you will never have to see. He looked at the folder. He looked at Claire. She was looking back at him with the expression of a woman who knew what was in that folder and had spent the last several years of her life operating on the assumption that it would stay in it. Lieutenant Claire Bennett, Holloway said, is listed in current service records as a military intelligence specialist with primary assignments in pattern analysis, enemy behavioral modeling, and strategic advisory support. That designation is accurate. He turned a page. Before that designation, he said, Lieutenant Bennett completed a selection and training program whose name I am not able to state in this context. I can tell you that the program has a completion rate of less than 12%. I can tell you that its graduates are assigned exclusively to operations classified above the standard clearance threshold for this evaluation. I can tell you that the technical disciplines included in its curriculum are not available through any military training program that appears in public documentation. Ryan Maddox felt the hair on the back of his neck move. He knew what programs had a 12% completion rate. He knew specifically what they did to the people who went through them. He knew with the bone-level knowledge of a man who had worked alongside their graduates on 3 separate operations, what those people were capable of and what it cost them to be capable of it. He had not looked at Claire Bennett this morning and thought any of those things. Not once. He had looked at her and thought analyst, screen, maps, theory. He had looked at her and seen what he had decided to see. The folder turned again. Between the ages of 22 and 26. Holloway continued. Lieutenant Bennett participated in 7 operational deployments in 4 theaters. The specific nature of those deployments cannot be disclosed. What can be disclosed is their outcome. He paused. All 7 operations achieved their objectives. In 3 of those operations, the mission plan had suffered critical structural failure before Lieutenant Bennett's involvement. In those 3 cases, the corrected plan was authored under active operational conditions in environments where the standard protocol was extraction rather than continued engagement. A sound moved through the troops. Not words. Something below words. The sound a crowd makes when information lands that does not just surprise them, but physically moves them. She stayed. Corporal Marisol Vega said quietly to no one, to everyone. When the plan broke, Dion said slowly, she stayed and fixed it. In the field, Marisol said. Dion did not answer, because Dion had been in the field when plans broke. He knew what that felt like. He knew what it asked of a person. He knew what you had to have inside you to choose to stay in that environment and continue functioning at the level of competence required to bring people home. He looked at Claire Bennett, and he felt something he rarely felt, which was awe, plain and uncomplicated, the awe of a person confronting something that exceeds the scale of their previous measurements. Holloway turned the final page. At 26 years old, Lieutenant Bennett requested reassignment to intelligence analysis. The request was granted. The reason for the request is personal and is not included in the materials I have been authorized to share. He closed the folder. What I can tell you is what her call sign was during the operational period of her service. The field held its breath. The Silent Falcon. It landed the way those 2 words always land when they are spoken by someone who knows what they mean in a space full of people who have heard them and people who have not, because the people who have heard them react in a way that tells the people who have not heard them exactly how significant they are. Ryan Maddox's head moved. Not a flinch. A specific involuntary reorientation of attention, the physical reflex of a man who has just heard a name he knows and is locating it in his memory. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes, standing 8 feet from him, made a sound that was somewhere between an exhale and a word. Ryan turned to look at him. Lucas's face was the color of a man who has just realized he missed something enormous. You know the name, Ryan said. I know the name, Lucas said. Tell me. Lucas looked at him. His voice was very low. 3 years ago, Kandahar adjacent. There was a combined unit operation that went wrong on the 2nd day. I wasn't there. A team I had trained was. He stopped. The plan collapsed. Enemy position had changed. The intelligence going in was 12 hours old by the time the team made entry, and the extraction corridor was blocked. They were running out of options in a very small amount of time. Ryan waited. Someone came back to them on the secure channel, Lucas said. Not their assigned support. Someone who had been monitoring the operational net and had seen the pattern breaking before the team on the ground had seen it. Someone who gave them a corrected extraction route and a secondary position analysis in real time under fire from a location that was not supposed to be inhabited by any Allied personnel. He stopped. The team made it out. All of them. He looked across the field at Claire Bennett. Nobody ever found out who the voice on the channel was. It was listed in the after-action report as an unidentified intelligence asset. Lucas was quiet for a moment. The team started calling it the Falcon, because it came out of nowhere, hit exactly what needed to be hit, and disappeared. Ryan Maddox stood in the field at Camp Redstone and felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with geology. That was her, he said. It was not a question. Lucas did not answer. He did not need to. Ryan looked across the field at Claire Bennett, who was standing exactly where she had been standing, while Holloway read from the folder with the same expression she had been wearing, which was the expression of a woman who has been in enough serious situations to know that the correct response to any of them, including this one, is simply to remain present and continue. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Holloway, who had stepped down from the command platform and was moving back toward the evaluation staff with the same measured authority he brought to everything. Ryan started walking. Not quickly. Not with the aggressive certainty that had characterized every movement he made in the morning. He walked the way a man walks when he is not entirely sure of his destination, but knows the direction is correct. He crossed the field. He stopped in front of Claire Bennett. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Around them, the field continued its activity, evaluation staff, compiling results, soldiers moving toward the debrief area. The ordinary machinery of military procedure, continuing exactly as it always continued, regardless of what was happening between two people at its edge. Kandahar, Ryan said. Claire was quiet for exactly long enough to make it clear that she was choosing her answer carefully. I've been in a lot of places, she said. 3 years ago, a team in an extraction failure, a voice on the secure channel that nobody could identify. Claire held his gaze. People make it home in a lot of ways, she said. Ryan took a breath. Were you in the field? The question cost him something to ask. Not because he was afraid of the answer, because asking it meant admitting out loud in the specific language of a direct question that he had spent this entire morning being certain about something he did not actually know. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. One word. Ryan closed his eyes for half a second. I called you a screen watcher, he said. You did. In front of 1,000 soldiers. In front of 1040, she said. And there was no edge in the correction, just precision, the same precision she applied to everything. He looked at her. Why didn't you say anything before the demonstration, before any of it? You could have said something that would have changed the entire morning. Claire tilted her head slightly. What would I have said, Chief? Anything. Your record, your history, the call sign, any of it. And what would that have accomplished? Ryan opened his mouth. He closed it, because he was in the process of understanding something, which was that the answer was not a simple one. If she had said this morning before the Eastern Corridor decision, before the demonstration, before any of it, I am the Silent Falcon. I have 7 operational deployments. I have a sub 12% training completion. The plan you're favoring will fail. What would have happened? Would he have listened? Would the 1040 soldiers around them have shifted their attention because of a credential, a name, a record? And what would that have taught them? That authority comes from biography. That you trust a person because of what their file says about them. That the way you earn the right to be heard is by presenting your history loudly enough that other people feel obligated to acknowledge it. That's not how it should work, Claire said quietly, reading him in the way she read everything. Not in the field, not anywhere. If I have to perform my history for you to trust my judgment, then the trust is in the history, not the judgment. And histories can be fabricated. Credentials can be manufactured. Judgment cannot. Ryan was quiet. What I know because of what I've done, she said. But you don't have to know what I've done to evaluate what I'm saying. You have to look at what I'm saying. Test it. Check it against the evidence that exists in front of you right now. She paused. That's what you didn't do this morning. No, he said. It's not. You didn't look at the Eastern Corridor analysis. You looked at me. You saw a category, and you responded to the category. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. It was the second honest word he had said all day, and it cost him more than the first. Staff Sergeant Dion Reeves was 40 feet away and could not hear the conversation, but he could see the two figures, Maddox and Bennett, and he could read body language the way a man reads it after 10 years of situations where misreading it could get him killed. He saw Maddox's shoulders. Not square and projected, not the posture of the morning. Lowered. The specific drop that happens when tension leaves a body, not through release, but through recognition. Something changed, Marisol said next to him. Something started, Dion said. Back at the edge of the field, Ryan Maddox said, the team in Kandahar, the ones you brought home. Yes. Were any of them SEAL trained? Claire looked at him. 2 of them. He nodded slowly. And when you came on the channel, when you gave them the corrected extraction route, did they listen? Eventually, she said, and for the first time all day, something crossed her face that was not calm, not precision, not the careful neutrality she had been maintaining since 0700 hours. It was something human, something small and real, the shadow of a memory that had not entirely stopped being heavy, even after 3 years and a reassignment and a classification that put it behind enough paper to keep most people from finding it. It took them 4 minutes and 11 seconds to accept the route, she said. We did not have 4 minutes and 11 seconds to spare. She paused. They made it out, but it was close. It was very close. Ryan looked at her. Because they didn't know who they were listening to, he said. Because they had already decided what they were listening to, she said. A voice. Unidentified. Not SEAL. Not established. Not visibly credentialed in the way they needed to see credentials to feel safe following an instruction into territory they did not know. She held his gaze. Sound familiar? It sounded exactly familiar. It sounded like every decision he had made that morning. It sounded like the Eastern Corridor. It sounded like the moment he had said, I'm the SEAL here, and heard it as a conclusion, rather than as the beginning of a question he should have been asking himself. Ryan Maddox looked at Claire Bennett in the afternoon light at Camp Redstone, in front of a field of soldiers that was gradually moving toward debrief and processing and the end of an evaluation day that none of them would forget, and he said, I need to ask you something. Ask it. Why did you request reassignment after everything you had done? After the operations? After Kandahar? Why did you come back to analysis? The question landed in the space between them and sat there for a moment. Claire looked at the middle distance for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, because I got tired of being the person nobody saw until they needed saving. The honesty of it hit Ryan Maddox like the evaluation results had hit him. Clean, direct, impossible to deflect. I was good at the work, she said. Very good. But good at the work meant being invisible until the work became necessary. And being visible only in crisis means that every time people look at you, they are looking at the worst moment they have ever been in. She paused. I wanted to do the work in a way that prevented the crisis, instead of surviving it. Ryan was quiet. That's why the Eastern Corridor mattered, she said. Not to prove something, not to win an argument, because if we took that approach and it failed, people would have paid for it. In a real deployment, they would have paid in ways that cannot be scored on an evaluation form. Ryan Maddox had been in the military for 17 years. He had held men's hands while they died. He had made decisions that sent people into situations they did not come back from. He had carried those decisions in the way that everyone who has made them carries them close to the center, mixed into everything else, present in the way that the most important things are always present, even when you are not thinking about them directly. He had spent 17 years building a framework for understanding how those decisions happened, and who was responsible for them, and what it meant to be the kind of person who made them correctly. And he had built that framework around the wrong thing. He had built it around himself, around SEAL, around deployment count, around the history that was his and visible and documented and real. Around the currency he had spent 17 years accumulating and brandishing and using to establish his position in every room he entered. He had built it around everything, except the one thing that actually mattered, which was the information in front of him, and whether he was willing to look at it clearly, regardless of where it came from. "I owe you an apology," he said. Claire looked at him. "I owe you one that's worth something," he said. "Not a debrief apology, not a procedural one." He met her eyes. "I dismissed you before you finished your first sentence. I said things in front of 1040 people that reduced everything you are to a category I had already decided you fit. And I was wrong. Not just about the corridor, about the way I operate, about the habit I've built of using what I am to avoid looking carefully at what other people are." Claire held his gaze for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Here, in front of the field." "Because I said the other things in front of the field," he said. "Because if the apology doesn't happen where the damage happened, then it's just personal management. It's not accountability." Something shifted in Claire's expression. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth. Something more durable than warmth. The recognition of a person who has been genuinely seen, perhaps for the first time today, perhaps for the first time in longer than that, and who is processing what it feels like to have that happen. General Holloway was 50 feet away. He was not looking at them, but the evaluation officer standing next to him was. And the evaluation officer said something quietly, and Holloway's chin moved in the slight controlled acknowledgement of a man who has received information that confirms something he already believed. Dion Reeves looked at Marisol Vega. "Write that down," he said. "Whatever you just watched. Write it down somewhere, because that is what it looks like when a man decides to be better than he was this morning." Marisol did not have anything to write on, but she did not forget. Neither did the 1040 soldiers who were present at Camp Redstone on that day, in that field, in that specific afternoon light, when a decorated Navy SEAL stood in front of a woman he had spent the morning dismissing, and told her the truth about himself, without performance, and without strategy, and without any of the armor he had spent 17 years learning to wear. And Claire Bennett listened. She listened the way she listened to everything. Completely. Without judgment that was faster than evidence. Without a category already prepared to receive what she was hearing. She listened like someone who understood from long and serious experience that the most important thing a person can do is look clearly at what is in front of them. And what was in front of her now was a man in the early stages of becoming something different from what he had been at 0700 hours. It was not finished. It was not even close to finished. But it had begun. The debrief started at 1400 hours, and everyone who had been on that field all day knew it was going to be different from every debrief they had attended before. Not because of the format. The format was standard. Officers assembled evaluation results, presented individual performance assessments, delivered after-action discussion, conducted in the measured procedural language that military debriefs use because precision matters more than comfort when the subject is mistakes and their consequences. The format was exactly the same as it always was. What was different was the room. The room was different because the people in it had spent the last 7 hours watching something that changed the way they were listening. They were not listening for what they were supposed to say. They were listening for what was true. And that distinction, which sounds small in the abstract, is the largest possible distinction in practice because it changes everything about what gets said and what gets left in the silence between words. General Holloway sat at the head of the table. Ryan Maddox sat 3 seats down on the left side. Claire Bennett sat at the far end where intelligence support officers customarily sat, which was to say at a distance that communicated supporting role rather than primary decision authority. Nobody had asked her to sit closer. Nobody had considered it. That was going to change. But it had not changed yet, and the not yet changed aspects of the situation were in their own way part of the lesson that the day was still in the process of delivering. Holloway opened the debrief with the Phase 1 results. He did not soften them. Holloway had not built a career on softening things. He presented the data exactly as the evaluation team had recorded it. Approach selection, inconsistent with available intelligence. Corridor failure at the 400-meter mark. 3 critical decision junctions, where the intelligence assessment was not incorporated into operational planning. Composite score for Phase 1 61 points out of a possible 100. The lowest first phase score the joint assessment had recorded in its 6-year history at Camp Redstone, which he stated without emphasis and without mercy, because that was what the number deserved. Ryan Maddox listened to every word. He did not look at the table. He did not look at his hands. He looked at General Holloway with the full attention of a man who has decided that the correct thing to do with a lesson is to receive it completely. Then Holloway read the Phase 2 results. 94 points. Highest composite score in 6 years. Individual decision accuracy in the top 3% of all recorded assessments. Communication clarity, adaptability response, and tactical integration all scored at exceptional levels. He read each category. He did not rush. He gave each number the time it deserved to land. When he finished, the room was quiet in a specific way. The quiet of people who have just been shown 2 data points that placed next to each other tell a story more clearly than any analysis could. I want to discuss what produced these results, Holloway said. Both of them. He looked at Ryan. Chief Maddox, you led Phase 1. Yes, sir. You received a tactical assessment from Lieutenant Bennett at the planning stage. You rejected it. Yes, sir. On what basis? Ryan could have cited doctrine. He could have cited his own assessment of the terrain, which was not entirely without merit. He could have constructed a reasonable-sounding professional rationale that would have satisfied a formal record while obscuring the actual reason. He did not. On the basis that I had already decided what kind of officer Lieutenant Bennett was before she finished speaking, he said. I used my background as a reason to dismiss her analysis without giving it the evaluation it deserved. That was the error. The corridor was the consequence. The room absorbed this. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes, seated 2 chairs from Maddox, kept his face carefully neutral. But his shoulders moved. A very small adjustment, the kind a man makes when he has heard something unexpected, said by someone he thought he knew, and is recalibrating his understanding of them in real time. Holloway held Ryan's gaze for a moment. Noted, he said. 2 syllables. Carrying the weight of a senior officer who has just watched a subordinate do something genuinely difficult and is choosing not to diminish it by saying too much. He turned to Claire. Lieutenant Bennett, Phase 2. Sir. Walk the room through the primary approach modification you implemented at the 14-minute mark. And Claire did. She talked through it the way she did everything directly, without preamble, without the performance of expertise that people deploy when they want the room to appreciate how smart they are, rather than understand what they are being told. She explained the terrain data, the pattern recognition that had flagged a secondary enemy position that the scenario designers had embedded in the exercise as a test variable. The adjusted western corridor that had added 4 minutes to the approach, but eliminated the primary threat to the extraction. The communication sequence she had established between the 3 element leaders to maintain coordination through terrain that broke line of sight at 2 critical junctions. She spoke for 6 minutes. Nobody interrupted. At the end of it, Captain Jerome Whitfield, who had been in the military for 18 years and had attended more debriefs than he could accurately count, said, Lieutenant, at the 14-minute mark, when you identified the secondary position, what was the information source? Claire looked at him. Pattern analysis from the pre-scenario intelligence brief, cross-referenced against the topographical movement data from the eastern approach failure in Phase 1. Jerome was quiet for a moment. You used the Phase 1 failure as a data point. Yes, sir. Failed approaches tell you as much about enemy positioning as successful ones, often more. The failure revealed where the opposing force had concentrated their defensive attention. That concentration had a shadow. The secondary position was in the shadow. Jerome looked at Maddox. Maddox was looking at Claire, and the expression on his face was not the expression he had been wearing at 0700 hours. It was not the expression of a man who has already decided what he is looking at. It was the expression of a man who is genuinely actively looking, who is watching something he has never seen before and is making the choice to see it clearly rather than fit it into the shape of something he already knows. She used the mistake, Jerome said quietly. Not to anyone specifically. To the room. She turned the mistake into information, Holloway said. That is a different skill from avoiding mistakes. It is in some ways a rarer one. Maddox said nothing, because what he was feeling in that moment was beyond the vocabulary of a debrief. It was not shame exactly. It was the specific feeling of a man who has spent 17 years understanding himself in a particular way and has, in the course of a single day, discovered that the understanding was partial. Not wrong exactly. Partial. Missing something fundamental. Missing the capacity to see capability in a shape he had not been trained to expect it in. He had trained himself to recognize excellence. He had simply, without ever consciously deciding to train himself to recognize it only in forms that resembled his own. Holloway closed the evaluation folder. Final composite score for the Joint Operational Readiness Assessment, 77.5, average of Phase 1 and Phase 2. He looked at the assembled officers. Above the threshold for deployment certification. Within range of the assessment's historical average. He paused. What that number does not capture is the significance of the delta between Phase 1 and Phase 2. A 33-point improvement achieved by a single integrated team in a 4-hour window is not a number I have seen in 6 years of running this assessment. He looked at the folder. I am adding a supplemental evaluation note to the permanent record. The note will read Phase 2 results attributable in primary part to tactical planning, led by Lieutenant Claire Bennett, Intelligence Specialist. Recommendation for expanded advisory role in upcoming deployment cycle under review. The room absorbed this. It was not a promotion. It was not a formal elevation of status or a change in Claire's official designation. But in the specific language of military evaluation records, which every officer in that room had spent years learning to read. It was the kind of note that changed what happened next. It was the kind of note that opened doors that had not been opened before. Not because someone had advocated for it loudly. Because the record simply showed what the record showed. Claire Bennett looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, sir." And that was all. No performance. No visible relief. No satisfaction that needed an audience. 2 words that meant exactly what they said, and nothing more. The debrief ended at 15:47. The evaluation officers left first. Then the tactical staff. Then the officers from the assembled units, filtering out in the way groups filter out after formal proceedings in clusters of 2 and 3 in the lower register conversations that are the real debrief after the official one ends. Ryan Maddox did not leave with the group. He stayed at the table after most of the room had emptied. He stayed the way a man stays when he is not finished with something and does not want to pretend otherwise by moving toward the exit. Lucas Hayes stayed too. Not because he had been asked to. Because Lucas Hayes had known Ryan Maddox for 9 years, and in 9 years he had learned to recognize the specific quality of Ryan's stillness that meant something important was happening and company was appropriate. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Lucas said, "I owe you a conversation I should have had this morning." Ryan looked at him. "When she put me down," Lucas said, "I knew immediately. Not after a minute of thinking about it. Immediately. In the way you know things that your body understands faster than your mind does." He paused. "I knew that what she had just done was not something a person learns in a standard training environment. I knew it was classified level training, and I said nothing." Ryan was quiet. "Why?" he said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Because you had already committed to the position, and because I had already been part of building the environment where that position felt correct. He looked at his hands. I didn't stand up in the planning area and say, "Chief, wait." I didn't tell you what I knew or suspected about her training background. I stood next to you and let the morning happen the way it happened. Ryan looked at him. You didn't know for certain. I knew enough. The honesty of it sat between them. We have been operating together for 9 years, Lucas said. And in 9 years, I have seen you be exactly right about most things most of the time. That kind of track record builds a kind of gravity. People orbit it. I orbit it. He paused. And sometimes orbiting a man's certainty means you stop trusting your own instincts when they diverge from his. Ryan processed this. It was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be. You should have said something, Ryan said. Yes. I would have listened. Lucas looked at him. And Ryan heard himself saying it, and he heard simultaneously the echo of every other time he had said something similar in his career. About information he had discounted. About assessments he had overridden. About the people around him who had let his certainty crowd out their own more careful reading of a situation. Maybe, Lucas said. Ryan closed his eyes for half a second. Maybe, he agreed. Outside the field at Camp Redstone was moving into the low amber light of late afternoon. Soldiers who had spent the day in a state of heightened focus were releasing that focus in the gradual necessary way of bodies that have been held at attention and are now allowed to rest. Conversations were happening. The specific conversations that happen after a day that was supposed to be one kind of thing and turned out to be another. Staff Sergeant Dion Reeves was sitting with Corporal Marisol Vega and 3 other soldiers near the edge of the equipment area, and they were having the conversation that would, in its various forms and iterations, travel from Camp Redstone through 3 different units and eventually reach people who had not been on that field at all. I've been in this uniform for 10 years, Dion said, and I have walked into more briefings than I can count. And I can tell you right now that the number of times I looked at the person leading the briefing before I decided how much attention to give them is a number I am not proud of. Nobody disagreed. We do it automatically, said Lieutenant Marcus Eng, who had been part of the blue team in Phase 1 and had watched the Eastern Corridor decision happen from 3 feet away. We walk in and we read the room in about 45 seconds, and we assign everyone a weight before they've said a word. And then we spend the entire briefing confirming what we already decided. Marisol was quiet. I did it too, she said. This morning, when Lieutenant Bennett was at the planning table, before she said anything, I had already filed her as a background figure. She paused. And I'm 23 years old. I've been in this branch for 2 years. I had decided that a lieutenant with 11 years more experience than me wasn't worth paying attention to. She looked at her hands. What does that say about me? It says you're human, Dion said. It doesn't excuse it, but it says you're human. Marcus Eng looked out at the field. What changes it because we're going to walk into the next briefing and do the same thing? Unless something changes. Nobody answered immediately. Then Dion said, You remember how she moved, when Hayes came at her, and when Maddox came at her. Yes, she was reading them, not reacting, not calculating, reading, like she had seen the movement before it happened. He paused. That is a skill, and it is not a physical skill. It is an attention skill. It is the skill of looking at what is actually there instead of what you expect to be there. He paused. She doesn't do it with people in combat. She does it with everything, with the map, with the briefing, with the information in front of her. She looks at what is actually there. The group was quiet. That's the lesson, Marcus said slowly. That's the whole lesson, Dion said. That is the thing today was about. In a small room off the main corridor of the operations building, Ryan Maddox found Claire Bennett at 1722. She was at a desk, working. Because she was always working, which was not something he had understood about her this morning, and understood completely now. She was not working to be seen working. She was not working to make a point about her dedication, or her capability, or anything else. She was working because the work existed, and she was the person positioned to do it, and she was doing it. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. Chief, she said. You have a minute. She looked at the work in front of her and then set it aside with the clean, decisive movement of someone who has made a choice and is not going to give it partial attention. Yes, she said. He came in. He did not sit down immediately. He stood near the door for a moment, in the way a man stands when he is trying to locate the right beginning for something that does not have an obvious one. I have been thinking, he said, about what you said this afternoon. About the team in Kandahar. The 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Claire waited. You said they hesitated because they didn't know what they were listening to. He paused. But that's not entirely accurate, is it? Something moved in Claire's expression. What do you mean? She said. They knew they were listening to someone who was giving them correct information. They could assess that in real time. The route you gave them would have been verifiable against their own terrain data within the first 60 seconds of beginning to move. He held her gaze. They didn't hesitate because they couldn't evaluate the information. They hesitated because the voice didn't sound like what they expected a qualified voice to sound like. In that context, at that moment, Claire was very still. Yes, she said. Because you were a woman, he said. He said it directly, without softening it. Because it was a true thing, and it deserved to be said in the language it occupied. Among other reasons, Claire said, unidentified, non-unit, no established relationship, multiple variables that didn't match the profile of a credible source in a crisis. She paused. But yes, among other reasons. Ryan sat down. He sat across from her in the small room with the low light and the work spread across the desk between them, and he looked at her the way he had not looked at her at 0700 hours. With the specific attention of a man who is trying to see something completely rather than confirm something he already believes. How many times, he said. She looked at him. How many times did you walk into a room and have to carry the weight of proving yourself before anyone would listen? Not in training, not in evaluation, in the field, in operational contexts where the proving yourself cost time and time was the thing people were dying from. The question landed in the room and sat there. Claire looked at the middle distance. More times than I kept track of, she said. And you stayed. I stayed. Why? She was quiet for a long moment. And when she answered, her voice had the quality it sometimes had when she was not translating something for an audience, but simply speaking the thing directly. Because the work mattered more than the frustration, she said. Because the soldiers on those operations were real people who needed the analysis to be correct, and the plan to be sound, and the information to arrive in time. And whether or not the person providing that was someone they were prepared to listen to was a problem I had to solve, not a reason to stop providing it. She paused. You don't walk away from necessary work because the environment makes the work harder. You find a way to make the work happen, and then you do it again. Ryan was quiet for a long time. Outside, the day was ending. The field was emptying. The 1040 soldiers who had assembled that morning for a joint operational readiness assessment were moving toward the ordinary routines of a military evening, toward meals and maintenance, and the low decompression conversations that follow high-intensity training days. I want to ask you something, Ryan said, and I want you to answer it honestly. I don't have another setting, she said. Today, he said, when I stepped into the circle, when I challenged you after Hayes, you could have refused. You had already made your point. You could have walked away. Yes. Why didn't you? Claire looked at him. Because refusing would have been a performance, she said. Stepping away to seem above the confrontation. That's not the same as actually being above it. It's managing an image. She paused. And because 1040 soldiers were watching, not to see me win, they were watching to understand something. And the only way they were going to understand it was if the thing actually happened. You knew what they needed to see, he said. I knew what the day required, she said. That's not the same as wanting it. Ryan heard this difference. He heard it the way he heard the Phase 1 evaluation results when he read them a second time. With the specific clarity that comes when you stop managing your reaction to something and simply allow yourself to understand it. For what it is worth, he said. And I know it is not worth as much as it should be, because the time when it should have been said was this morning, and this is afternoon. I am sorry. He held her gaze. Not procedurally, not for the record. I am sorry because what I did was wrong in ways that go beyond a tactical decision and a poor evaluation score. I made assumptions about who you were that reduced you to a category I had invented before you finished your first sentence. I said things in public that reflected the worst of what this kind of certainty produces, and I was wrong. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Chief, she said. Ryan, he said. She held that for a second. Ryan, she said. I accept the apology. Not because it erases the morning. It doesn't. But because it's real. And real things matter more than comfortable ones. She paused. What I want you to take from today is not the apology. It's the question you were asking yourself when you were reading the Phase 1 breakdown. The one you were asking when you looked at me on the field. Keep asking it. What question? What am I not seeing? She said. And why? Ryan Maddox sat in the low light of that small room and felt something settle in him. Not resolution. Not the clean completion of a lesson fully absorbed. Something more honest than that. The specific, uncomfortable settling of a man who has encountered the edge of his own understanding and is deciding for the first time clearly and without performance that the edge is not a threat. It is the beginning of the only kind of growth that matters. He had said, I'm the seal here with absolute certainty at 0700 hours. He understood now what that certainty had cost him. Not the evaluation score, not the corridor, not the demonstration in front of 1040 soldiers. What it had cost him was the morning itself. The hours he could have spent understanding something real, learning something that his 17 years had not given him, working alongside a person whose capability exceeded his own. In dimensions he had never had the maps for. He had spent those hours being certain. And certainty in the specific flavor he had been carrying was not strength. It was the shape strength takes when it stops growing. He stood. Thank you, he said. Claire picked up her work. Get some sleep, Ryan, she said. Tomorrow's evaluation cycle starts at 0600. He stopped in the doorway. Will you be at the planning brief? She looked up. I'm always at the planning brief, she said. He nodded. He walked out into the late evening, into the cooling air of the Arizona desert, into the end of the most significant day of his professional life, which had begun with him announcing his own importance to 1040 soldiers, and was ending in a small room where a woman with a classified call sign had taught him something no deployment had managed to. He did not know what tomorrow looked like, but for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely curious to find out. The 0600 planning brief. The next morning was a different room from the one that had existed 24 hours earlier. Same table, same maps, same Camp Redstone, same Arizona air, carrying the same dry heat that arrived before the sun finished rising. Everything that could be measured in physical terms was identical to the morning before. But the people in it were not the same people. Not because they had changed overnight in the dramatic, permanent way that stories sometimes compress change into. People do not work that way. The real changes that matter in a person's life do not happen overnight. They begin overnight. They begin in the specific hours after a day that asked more of you than you expected to give, in the sleepless stretches where the mind goes back to what happened and asks different questions than it asked in the moment. Ryan Maddox had slept 4 hours. Not because he could not sleep. Because he chose not to. He sat in his quarters with the Phase 1 evaluation breakdown on the table in front of him and the ceiling above him, and he worked through something that had no tactical name and no official category in any military assessment framework. But that was he was beginning to understand the most important thing he had ever worked through. He was revising himself, not catastrophically. Not the self-destruction that happens to men who cannot metabolize failure. Something more careful than that. He was going back through the architecture of his certainty, the framework he had built across 17 years and 11 deployments and more successful operations than he could accurately remember, and he was looking at what it was made of. Looking at the foundation. Looking at where the load-bearing elements were, and which of them were genuinely strong, and which of them had been carrying weight they were not built to carry. He found more of the latter than he expected. He did not enjoy the finding. He did it anyway. At 0540, he got up, put on his uniform, and walked to the briefing area 17 minutes early. Claire Bennett was already there. She was always already there. He understood that now. She had probably been there for 30 minutes, reviewing data, adjusting analysis, doing the invisible preparatory work that made everything that followed look effortless to people who did not understand that effortlessness is always the product of invisible effort. She looked up when he came in. "Chief," she said. "Ryan," he said. She held that for a beat. Then Ryan. He sat down across from her. Not at the head of the table. Across from her. The deliberate geography of a man who has decided where he belongs in a conversation, and it is not at the position of unquestioned authority. "I want to go through the day's scenario before the others arrive," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because yesterday I spent the planning phase not listening to you. I would like to try the opposite approach and see what it produces." Something crossed Claire's face that was not quite a smile and was not the careful neutrality she deployed in most professional interactions. It was something between those two things. The specific expression of a person who has heard something they did not expect and is deciding whether to believe it is real. She decided. She turned the map toward him. And for the next 16 minutes before any other officer arrived, Ryan Maddox sat across from Claire Bennett and listened. Fully. Without the running parallel commentary in his head that sorted incoming information by source credibility before allowing it to land. Without the 17-year reflex of measuring what he heard against his own experience and discounting what did not match it. He listened the way he had trained himself to listen in the field, in the operational dark, when the information coming through the channel was the only thing standing between his team and a decision that could not be unmade. He listened like the information mattered more than the person providing it. He listened like they were the same thing. By the time the other officers arrived at 0600, Ryan had 3 questions about the northern approach that he had not had before. 2 of them Claire answered immediately. The third one she paused on, turned the map slightly and said, "That's a good question. I want to run the pattern data against the overnight intelligence update before I answer it." Ryan Maddox said, "Take the time you need." And something happened in the room at that moment, subtle and real. The way real things always happen without announcement, without drama. The officers filing in read the dynamic between the 2 figures at the planning table and recalibrated without consciously deciding to recalibrate. Captain Jerome Whitfield sat down and oriented his attention toward Claire's end of the table without anyone suggesting he should. Lieutenant Marcus Eng pulled out his notebook and opened it to a fresh page before Claire had said a single word, because he had learned in the previous day that when she spoke, it was worth writing down. Senior Chief Lucas Hayes took a position near the map table and settled into the specific, attentive stillness of a man who is done performing certainty and has decided that learning is more interesting. General Holloway arrived at 0610. He stood in the doorway for approximately 4 seconds reading the room. Then he walked in and sat down. He said nothing about what he observed. He did not need to. The planning brief ran for 41 minutes. In those 41 minutes, 4 significant decisions were made about the day's scenario approach. 3 of them came directly from Claire's analysis. The 4th came from a question Ryan Maddox asked that produced data neither of them had considered independently, and when it emerged from the combination of his operational instinct and her pattern analysis, Captain Jerome Whitfield looked up from his notes and said quietly, "That's the approach. That's the one." It was. The day's scenario confirmed it in the first 20 minutes of execution. But the scenario was not the point. The scenario was a vehicle. What it was carrying was larger. What it was carrying was the daily unglamorous, unrewarded work of people deciding to operate differently than they had operated before. Not because it was celebrated. Not because it was easy. Because it was correct. And correct in the end is the only standard that matters when the alternative is people paying for your errors in currencies you cannot repay. 3 days after the Joint Operational Readiness Assessment, General Holloway submitted the supplemental evaluation report he had mentioned in the debrief. The report was 6 pages. 5.5 of those pages addressed the assessment results. The Phase 1 failure analysis. The Phase 2 exceptional performance documentation and the formal recommendation for Lieutenant Claire Bennett's expanded advisory role in the upcoming deployment cycle. The final half page addressed something that did not typically appear in evaluation reports. It addressed leadership behavior. Not in the accusatory language of a formal reprimand. In the language of a senior officer who has watched something significant happen and believes the record should reflect it completely. Holloway wrote, "The Phase 1 failure was primarily attributable to the dismissal of qualified intelligence analysis on the basis of a perceived credential hierarchy that did not reflect the actual capability distribution within the advisory team. This failure produced a 33-point score deficit that required exceptional performance in Phase 2 to offset. The behavior that produced the failure, specifically the dismissal of Lieutenant Bennett's assessment without evaluation of its content, is not an isolated personal failure. It is a systemic tendency that this command has observed across multiple assessment cycles, and that today's events bring into clear relief." This report recommends a formal review of how advisory team compositions are structured, how intelligence specialist input is weighted at the planning stage, and what institutional frameworks currently exist or fail to exist that allow credential-based dismissal of analytical input to function as a de facto operational standard. He signed it. He submitted it to the regional command. Hein knew what it would do and what it would not do, which is to say, he knew it would open a conversation that would take years to fully resolve, and that some elements of it would never fully resolve, because the thing it was addressing was not a regulation, but a habit, and habits do not change because a report is filed. They change because enough people who know better start doing better, often day after day, in the ordinary moments that never appear in any official record. Ryan Maddox received a copy. He read it twice. He thought about whether it stung. It did. He thought about whether it should. It should. He put it in the same place. He had put the Phase 1 breakdown, which was a folder that lived on his desk rather than a filing cabinet, because he had decided that these were documents that deserved proximity rather than storage. Documents that deserved to be seen regularly, not archived. Because the purpose of a record of where you went wrong is not to commemorate the error, but to keep asking the question that the error raised. What am I not seeing? And why? On the 5th day after the assessment, something happened that nobody at Camp Redstone had been expecting. A request came through official channels from a unit that had been operating in the same regional theater as the upcoming deployment cycle. The request was for intelligence advisory support for a specific pre-deployment planning operation. High complexity. Time sensitive. Multiple converging intelligence streams that needed synthesis and pattern analysis at a level the unit's current analytical staff could not provide in the available window. The request named a specific officer. It asked for Lieutenant Claire Bennett, by name, not by designation, not by role, not by the category of military intelligence specialist that her official file placed her in, by name. Because somewhere in the operational network across the classified channels and the careful word of mouth that moves through military communities in the specific way that important information moves, which is quietly, person to person, in the language of people who have learned to trust certain sources over others, the name Claire Bennett had been circulating. Not as the Silent Falcon, as herself, as the officer who had produced a 33-point turnaround in a joint assessment at Camp Redstone, as the officer who had walked into a planning brief and looked at a map that experienced operators had cleared as viable, and said the Eastern approach is a trap before anyone with 11 deployments was willing to consider it. As the officer who had given a requesting unit in a high-pressure environment exactly the analysis they needed in exactly the time they needed it, without ceremony, and without the performance of importance that lesser people use to make themselves feel consequential. General Holloway read the request. He approved it in 40 minutes. He called Claire into his office at 1400 hours and placed the approved request on the desk between them. She read it. She read it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Then she set it down. "Sir," she said, "before you say anything." Holloway said, "I want to be clear about what this is and what it is not. This is not a promotion. This is not a formal elevation of your current designation. The paperwork will reflect an advisory detachment assignment, which is within the standard parameters of your current role. He held her gaze. What it is the beginning of your record showing what you actually are. Not what the file says. What you are. Claire looked at the request. She looked at Holloway. Why now? She said. My capability has been the same since I arrived at this command. Holloway was quiet for a moment. Your capability has been the same, he said. The people around you have changed. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 8 months at Camp Redstone, and she received it the way she received honest things, without flinching, without performing emotion. She did not feel with the steady acknowledgement of a person who has learned that the truth, even when it is late, is still worth having. I'll take the assignment, she said. I know you will, Holloway said. She picked up the folder and stood. Sir, she said at the door. The review you submitted to Regional Command. The one about advisory team structure and intelligence weighting. Holloway looked at her. It will make some people uncomfortable, she said. Yes, he said. Good, she said. She walked out. In the corridor outside Holloway's office, she passed Ryan Maddox, who was walking in the opposite direction, and stopped when he saw her. They stood in the corridor for a moment. I heard about the advisory request, he said. She looked at him. Word travels fast. In this command, yes. He held her gaze. Congratulations. It's an assignment, she said, not a trophy. I know, he said. That's why I said congratulations and not well done. Well done implies it's finished. He paused. Congratulations implies it's beginning. Claire looked at him. The man standing in front of her was not the man who had grabbed her map and thrown it to the ground in front of 1040 soldiers 5 days earlier. Or he was that man, the same body, the same history, the same 11 deployments and decorated service record and physical capability that had always been real, regardless of everything else. But something in him had shifted in the way that real shifts happen below the level of performance in the actual structure of how he was oriented toward the world. I was looking at her. Not at the category. At her. Ryan, she said. Yes. When we get to the deployment cycle, when you are in the field and I am running advisory support from the intelligence position. She held his gaze. If I tell you an approach is a trap, I need to know you will listen before the corridor confirms it. Ryan Maddox did not hesitate. Yes, he said. Not because of Holloway's report. Not because of what happened in the assessment. I know. Because the information is worth evaluating on its own terms. Yes, he said. Because the information is worth evaluating on its own terms. The corridor was quiet between them for a moment. Then we'll be fine, she said. She walked on. He watched her go with the specific expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward, and is only now taking a full accounting of the distance covered. 2 weeks later, the deployment cycle began. The integrated advisory team that shipped out from Camp Redstone was structured differently from the standard composition that the command had been using for the previous 3 assessment cycles. The difference was not dramatic on paper. On the organizational chart, it looked like a minor adjustment. Intelligence Advisory Specialist moved from supporting role to co-primary in the planning phase. Input weighting in the pre-operation assessment given equal consideration regardless of source designation. A single sentence added to the briefing protocol, all analytical input to be evaluated on content before source. 1 sentence, on a bureaucratic document that most soldiers would read once and file. But the officers who had been on the field at Camp Redstone 5 days earlier knew what that sentence was. They knew where it came from. They knew the morning it had been born, in the conversation it had cost the specific field, with 1040 witnesses, and 1 woman who had stood in front of a man twice her career age and said the Eastern approach is a trap without raising her voice, or softening the message, or waiting for permission to be correct. Staff Sergeant Dion Reeves was part of the deployment cycle. He read the new briefing protocol on the first morning. He read it twice. Then he looked at Corporal Marisol Vega across the table and said nothing. He did not need to. She had already read it. She was already writing in the notebook she had started carrying after the assessment. Not orders. Not tactical data. The things that deserve to be remembered. The things that did not make it into official documents, but were the actual content of what the day had meant, she wrote. The sentence that changed the room came from a woman who had earned the right to shout and chose to be quiet. She did not perform her capability. She simply used it. And then she waited for the world to catch up to what it should have already known. She closed the notebook. She put it in her jacket pocket. The deployment cycle was long and demanding and produced over its course 11 separate planning operations of varying complexity. In those 11 operations, the integrated advisory team structure that had begun as a single-sentence adjustment to a bureaucratic briefing protocol produced outcomes that the evaluation team would later document as statistically significant in every measurable category. Decision accuracy, approach viability, extraction success rate, time from intelligence delivery to operational application. Every category moved, not because of any single person, not because of a demonstration on a field in Arizona, not because of a classified call sign or a 6-page evaluation report, or a conversation in a corridor, or a man who spent 4 hours in the middle of the night revising the architecture of his own certainty. Because of all of it. Because of the accumulated weight of a single day that asked 1040 people to look at what they were doing and why they were doing it, and whether what they were seeing was actually what was there. Claire Bennett ran advisory support for all 11 operations. She was not famous for it. She was not publicly credited in the way that operators are credited with citations and ceremony, and the visible markers of recognition that the military uses to signal to the rest of its members that a thing was done and it mattered. The nature of advisory intelligence support and the nature of the specific work Claire Bennett did was that its success looked like other people's success. A plan that worked looked like the operator who executed it. An approach that avoided disaster looked like good fortune. A decision that saved lives in the planning room looked like competence in the field. That was fine with Claire. It had always been fine with Claire. Not because she did not understand what she was doing or did not value it. Because she had learned in the years of classified operations and the 3 years since that the measure of important work is not whether it is visible, but whether it is real. Whether the thing that needed to happen happened. Whether the people who needed to come home came home. Everything else was supplementary. But something had changed. Not in the work. In the environment around the work. The officers who had been at Camp Redstone brought something back with them that they had not brought to previous deployment cycles. A habit. Specific and small and not dramatic enough to appear in any official documentation, but real enough to change what happened in every room they entered. They looked before they decided, not at the credential, at the content. They asked questions they would not have asked before, not because the questions were new, but because they had been reminded that the questions were necessary. They paused in the half-second before dismissal and put into that half-second the question that the day at Camp Redstone had deposited in them. What am I not seeing, and why? Not every time. No one does it every time. That is not how habits work at the beginning. They work at the beginning. The way everything works at the beginning, imperfectly, inconsistently, with more lapses than successes, and more effort than ease. But the direction was correct. And direction held consistently over time is the only variable that determines where a person ends up. Ryan Maddox submitted a formal development proposal to the regional command in the 4th week of the deployment cycle. The proposal was for a new training element to be incorporated into the Joint Operational Readiness Assessment going forward. Not an additional scenario. Not an additional technical skill evaluation. A half-day module on intelligence advisory integration specifically focused on the mechanisms by which qualified analytical input is filtered or dismissed at the planning stage and the operational consequences of that filtering when it occurs. He cited the Phase 1 results. He cited the Phase 2 results. He cited the delta between them. He cited the work of Claire Bennett without naming her directly, because the specifics of her case involved clearance levels. He did not have authority to reference in a development proposal, but in language that any officer who had been on that field would recognize immediately. The proposal was accepted. It was accepted not because it was written by a decorated SEAL with 11 deployments, though it was. It was accepted because the data behind it was irrefutable, and because the regional command had received Holloway's supplemental evaluation report 3 weeks earlier and had been looking for an entry point into the conversation that report demanded. Ryan Maddox had given them one. When Claire found out about the proposal, she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You cited the Phase 1 failure in a formal document." "Yes," Ryan said. "Your own failure, in your own proposal, as the primary evidence for why the training is necessary." "Yes." "That took something," she said. "It took less than I expected," he said. "Once I decided it was the right thing to do, the doing of it was simpler than the deciding." He paused. "That surprised me." Claire looked at him. "It usually does." He held her gaze. "I have been thinking about what you said, about why you requested reassignment, about being the person nobody saw until they needed saving." "Yes. I want to ask you something I have no right to ask." "Ask it." "Was it worth it?" Coming back to analysis, choosing the work nobody sees after everything you had done that at least some people saw. The question sat in the air between them. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of a person avoiding an answer. The quiet of a person who is going to give a real one and is locating it accurately before speaking. "Yes," she said, "but not for the reason you might expect." "Tell me." "It was worth it because the work in analysis is preventative," she said. "The operations I ran before they were necessary. They addressed situations that had already become emergencies. I went in after the collapse and tried to bring people back from the edge." She paused. "What I do now means sometimes the collapse doesn't happen. Sometimes the trap is identified before anyone walks into it. Sometimes the plan is correct before the first boot hits the ground, and because it is correct, nothing spectacular happens. Nobody gets pulled from an edge. Nobody needs a voice on a secure channel with 4 minutes and 11 seconds to spare." She held his gaze. "That invisibility," she said, "is not a cost. It is the best possible outcome." Ryan Maddox looked at her. He had spent 17 years in a profession that honored visible courage. Physical presence in dangerous environments. The willingness to walk into fire and be seen walking into it. The markers of a warrior life that are by their nature dramatic and recognizable and built to be recorded and cited and passed on. I understood in this moment, with the full weight of everything the last 3 weeks had cost and produced and changed in him, that he had spent 17 years honoring one form of courage while remaining entirely blind to another form that was in its own way equally demanding. The courage to do necessary work without recognition. The courage to be correct in a room that has decided not to listen. The courage to stay when leaving would have been simpler, and no one would have blamed you for it, and to keep providing what was needed to people who did not understand what they were receiving. He had called her a screen watcher. She had been the voice that brought people home from the edge of operations that official records would never fully describe. He had said, "I'm the SEAL here." She had said the Eastern approach is a trap. She had been right. She had always been right. And the most important thing he had learned in 17 years of service, the thing that had cost him the most to learn, and that he was least likely to ever forget, was not how to breach a building in the dark, or how to function under fire, or how to lead men through the specific geography of genuine danger. It was this: the most capable person in the room is not always the loudest. The most important voice is not always the most credentialed. And the woman standing quietly at the edge of the field, the one no one is watching because they have already decided she is not worth watching, is sometimes the person who has already saved more lives than the man at the center of it all will ever know. Ryan Maddox knew that now. Not because he had been told it, because on a training field in Arizona, in front of 1040 witnesses, he had been the man who refused to listen, and she had been the woman who was right anyway. And the distance between those two things was the most important distance he had ever crossed, and he had crossed it. That was the lesson Camp Redstone gave to every soldier who was present that day, the lesson that traveled outward from that field through 3 units and 2 deployment cycles and 1 training proposal and 1 6-page evaluation report and 11 planning operations, and 100 small moments in 100 ordinary rooms where people paused before they dismissed and asked instead of assumed, and looked at what was actually there before deciding they already knew. The lesson did not have a call sign. It did not have a ceremony. It did not need one. It was already doing its